Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. Today, we have something of a special edition for you. We're going to catch up with a friend of the show, but from a fresh perspective. Today, my guest is UBS Global Wealth Management Chief Investment Officer Mark Haefele. He's here to talk about his new book, The New Rules of Investing: Essential Wealth Strategies for Turbulent Times. Co-written with Richard C. Morace and published by HarperCollins Leadership, the volume outlines Haefele's view that new developments in everything from global affairs to demographics to technology mean that we need to change the way we think about investing. As the CIO of UBS, the world's largest global wealth manager, Mark oversees a team that manages and advises around $4 trillion of clients' invested wealth. In this playbook for protecting and growing wealth, Haefele shares the investing strategies he uses at UBS and explains a potential framework for investors to deal with turbulent times shaped by the so-called 5 Ds: debt, deglobalization, demographics, digitalization, and decarbonisation. It's a pleasure to welcome Mark back to the programme. Mark Haefele, always a delight to chat to you. And I'm going to start off by issuing my congratulations, because I'm always blown away when anybody, as a jobbing journalist, I'm always impressed if anybody can get a book out of the door, especially a man as busy as yourself. So congrats on The New Rules of Investing. And let's start right there. Why was the time now to commit this set of your smart thoughts to paper? Give us the quick origin story, if you will, Mark.
I think there were a couple of things that made me feel like it was a good time for this. The first is, in my own life, I kind of felt like I've had different stages. I was an academic historian, economic historian. Then I was a hedge fund manager. And for the past 14 years, I've been dealing with clients all around the globe in the wealth management situation and helping them manage their wealth and learning from them about how they manage their wealth. So all the elements were there. But then there were two catalysts that came together. The first really was COVID and how it highlighted for me just how much the world had changed since when I started investing almost 30 years ago. And so I really wanted to capture that and help people understand the changes that I see. And the second was this tremendous author, Richard Morace, came to me and said, "Hey, I really want to do this. I think we can make something great." And that collaboration was amazing because I would write something and he would say, "Okay, yeah, that's great." And then he would send it back to me and it wouldn't make any sense to me. And we'd go back and forth until we had something that we thought that most people could understand. So it's not written in economic jargon, or this is not an academic textbook.
Before we talk a bit more about some of the substance of the book, of course, which I want to get into, just there's a couple of things in there that underpin the story, which I think are really interesting and maybe explain your particular facility as a storyteller and some of your success, Mark, in the job you do at UBS, which is kind of come back to this idea of the emotions involved and that it is an emotional enterprise. I think sometimes people maybe make the mistake, don't they, of thinking that people who are skilled at investment or investment strategy and advice are clinical and cold and somehow detached from their emotions. But part of it is being an emotional individual, understanding those things and being informed by emotions when you make hopefully good decisions, right?
Absolutely. This is just so important to everything in investing. And, when I started 30 years ago, the field of behavioral finance didn't really exist at all. And, kind of read about it academically, but it's really in talking to all these clients around the world that I realized that's the crux of it. And in fact, people need to understand it's not like people who are billionaires are any better at the emotional side of it. But some of them, have the time and the energy and the desire to develop strategies to deal with it. And that is often the most important thing that we help clients with and what they've taught me over the years.
Well, yeah, look, you mentioned strategy. Let me ask you about this, because you make the point that strategic asset allocation, the UBS Wealth Way, Mark, something we've discussed obviously before on this program and others. They're both wealth management techniques, right? But it's an interesting point, and you tell the story interestingly and amusingly in the book. These things require buy-in, literally and metaphorically, from investors. Is one of your, aspirations a little bit with the book, maybe that investors will read it and then they'll understand better why they need to follow the advice that you give them?
Well, I hope so, and thank you for saying that. I mean, I started as somebody who was addicted to stock picking. And I got to a point in my life where I had to break that addiction. And it wasn't just for, emotional or life enjoyment reasons, but it was also really because I saw this element where the investment world was changing and started to realize both on an emotional level, but also on an intellectual level, that much more of your returns over time do come from worrying about your asset allocation rather than trying to pick individual stocks.
Mark, let me then ask you next about the subheader, if you like. Obviously, the book is The New Rules of Investing, Essential Wealth Strategies for Turbulent Times. And we often talk about the challenges of that kind of volatility on good decision making. Tell me why, again, it's timely for this book to come out now, and why maybe the particular kind of turbulence that we're experiencing necessitates or should prompt looking in a fresh way and challenging some of the older assumptions about shrewd investing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were faced with a challenge in working with clients because when we got past COVID and into the war in Ukraine, the return of land war in Europe, our clients were almost so paralyzed with fear in some cases, they really had a hard time investing. They kind of overwhelmed with it. And we tried to come up with a framework to help people understand this. We call it the 5 Ds. It's debt, deglobalization, demographics, digitalization, and decarbonization. And looking at the world through those very large forces, which are shaping our world today and also creating opportunities. So I think all of those things are troubling, but if you get in the right framework, you can also see them for their opportunity.
Mark, a couple of the sort of key takeaways from the book, and there's so much depth and detail and some lovely anecdotes, some of which I'll ask you about in a minute. But a couple of the key takeaways which I thought are interesting, and I wanted to just get you to sort of unpack a little bit for our audience. How to follow the money, and this was interesting, looking at how governments invest and how that can and should maybe shape decision making. Tell us a little bit about why that is an instructive insight for even lay investors and certainly ultra high net worth investors to be keeping front of mind.
Sure. So I feel like I grew up in a world and studied in books about how there's a market and we live in a market economy and we invest in markets and things. And almost for some people, it's almost a ideological or emotional resistance to the idea that we don't really have those things anymore. And I wanted to shake that up and challenge that a little bit by saying kind of how you want to be buying what the government is buying. And the point is that, when I talked about those 5 Ds, those are all big problems. And where the big problems are, that's where governments are deciding to put the big money to work on them. I mean, we think about decarbonization, which for many governments means fighting climate change. We think about digitalization. That's about AI, and maybe AI is going to be an existential threat or a security threat, and how governments are spending a lot of money on that. And when we talk about demographics, that's aging and the way that Western populations are aging, and that's requiring new drugs and changes to the political economy and structures of societies. And so for these big problems, that's where government's spending big money, and that's creating new and different economic and investment opportunities.
Mark, another thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about was this idea of getting results that go kind of beyond the balance sheet. And I think it's interesting, I'm sure over certainly your time in the role that you have currently in UBS, that the discourse has shifted in terms of what people's expectations or ambitions are with their investing. And it's not just about having, a secure setup and a long-term view. It becomes also about causes and purpose and impact. Just talk to us briefly, because I know the book obviously touches on this, about how you can, indeed how you should, integrate that kind of thinking into your portfolio planning and all of your other financial decision making.
Absolutely. And I think for me, where I've learned the most from our best clients, our wealthiest clients, is they kind of, for many of them, they're starting to develop almost a second act. They've made their money. They know how to keep their money, but they want to do something more. And that is use their wealth, not just give it away, but use their wealth to invest, to have a positive social impact. We call it impact investing. And I've got a lot of stories from real clients that we work with, how they're doing this. It aligns them with this idea of thinking about what the big problems are and where the big money is being spent. And they're certainly doing this to profit, but they're doing it in a way that aligns with a particular set of values they have. And it's kind of going beyond the core of making money and protecting and growing that wealth in the normal way. And right now, it's harder for average investors to do this because there aren't quite as many instruments. But that's really where the industry's going, because if you can do good and do well, why wouldn't you do that? And so that's where we're devoting a lot of our efforts. And I think we've made some interesting progress on that.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned the S-word, stories there. And again, it might be with my journalist hat on, but I can't actually remember which chapter in. I was leafing through and there was a great scene that you set in the book, Mark, if you'll indulge us by repeating some of it for our listeners. It was, you head to, I think it's an agreeable sounding lunch. Is it at John Griffin's? And there's all kinds of legends in the room. Daniel Kahneman's there, who's also appeared on this programme. Paul Tudor-Jones, Julian Robertson, these kinds of like some stellar names. And at the risk of getting you to boil a really beautifully crafted scene, just down to a short soundbite. Tell me a little bit about that and why that made the pages, because that was one of my sort of nerdy financial heart, and that was maybe one of my favourite tales.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was some years ago while I was still really on the hedge fund side of things and got invited to this lunch, and we're just sitting there together and got in a conversation with Paul Tudor-Jones, who was talking about what makes him a better trader and how he's so disciplined, writing down everything he does so that he knows when he's in the optimal state to make good trades. And then, of course, Professor Kahneman, God rest his soul, is sitting there and he's listening to this, and they start talking about how, well, Paul, if you have these data sets, I'd love to analyze them for you. And he's trying to pitch kind of getting a hold of the data. So, because if they can figure out how to build the perfect trader with a mix of emotion and analytics, there's a fortune to be made. All I can say is I don't know if they closed the deal, but that work, if it was ever done, has never been published.
And I guess it's time for you to remind people there aren't really any shortcuts, are there, Mark? I think in the book, again, it's about, is it after a glass of OJ or at 3 p.m., not 4 p.m.? There's not really any shortcuts, is there? I guess people can get your book. That's a bit of a shortcut.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was such in a way, scary for me, but a relief for me. I'm sitting here with the greatest trader in the world, and he's writing down if he had a glass of orange juice and that helped him or hurt him get in the peak state of mind where he can do his trades and he'll only trade at certain times in the day. To hear that made me sit up and say, hey, if the greatest trader in the world needs to pay attention to this kind of detail, what does a mere mortal like me have to do? Yeah, there's a lot of anecdotes like that in the book.
Another thing that I wanted to ask you about, Mark, is, I started off by sort of congratulating you on completing this endeavour. It's always impressive to consign one's thoughts so coherently onto the page. It's also very personal, isn't it, writing a book? And there's some lovely tales in there. You go right back to your childhood and how the sort of the seeds of interest in not just economics, but economics history were planted. I don't know, as almost a personal exercise, was that useful? And did it sort of remind you how you come to be in the big chair that you're in today? Going right back to the beginning, watching those, so it's not just economic history, it's like Mark's personal history a little bit as well. Was that a kind of a fun process?
Well, I don't know about fun. It was incredibly embarrassing and it did bring up a lot of things. I would remember incidents. There's an incident in a book about me and my father and a gas pump and things that would just come out. And so I think it was painful, but I did it because I felt like just telling people that your personal baggage and things are all there when you're staring at the screen ready to make a trade. That's not enough. I really had to show that I had lived it and maybe come through the other side on some of this, I hope, and that, it's going to be okay. And it does feel good to get it out.
Absolutely, Mark. And I should say to our listeners, of course, they can, I think, pre-order the book or buy it now via HarperCollins, of course, publishers. I think there's links through UBS as well. So plenty of ways to get hold of it. Just as a closing thought then, Mark, what do you hope this book does? I think you've already talked a little bit about its utility for investors, existing ones, prospective ones, of course, and for lay readers. But I don't know, it's always funny. Do you hope what it can achieve, is that the same as what your ambitions were in the abstract before you even started writing it, or does it change a little? Where do you hope this story goes next?
I think there's a couple of things that I hope it achieves, and they come out in the book. But I think the big one is to help people really delve into what is their relationship to their money, what do they want it to be, and how do they rationally and emotionally make the decision, this is what I'm going to do myself, this is what I might ask to get some professional help with, and just get to a better relationship with their wealth. Maybe go from just investing or thinking about their money, accumulating money, to managing their wealth and what that can really mean. So, I think we can all have a better relationship to our money and our wealth, and I hope it helps some people improve things.
The brilliant Mark Hafley, bringing us to the end of this edition of the programme on Monocle Radio. You can listen again and explore more at monocle.com. That's where you can and should join the club by subscribing to Monocle magazine. You can also follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, you can discover more and find out how UBS, Mark and his colleagues can help you by heading to ubs.com. And as I mentioned a little earlier in the programme, you can pick up a copy of Mark's book through that UBS website or via Mark's publisher, HarperCollins Leadership. This is The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.